So I want to begin by saying good morning to everybody. If you don't know me, my name is Blaise and I'm the Director of Responsible Business Practice here in the Office of Purpose for Fujitsu Australia and New Zealand. So good morning or good afternoon from wherever you're dialing in from. If we have any colleagues dialing in from New Zealand, kia ora koutou to you. And I would like to begin by acknowledging the fact that this morning I'm on Gameraigal country. And a few words. So Gameraigal is actually a new word. It's a new country affiliation. You might have heard it referred to it as Ku-ring-gai country. And actually, local traditional custodians did some research and they found that that word was an invented word. It was invented by white people, by historians, and it wasn't actually part of the traditional language or the traditional identity of the people of this area in Sydney where I live. And so it's been changed. And I always really think about this story because I think it reminds us of two things. One is firstly, how much was lost during that process of colonisation and the absolute disruption to culture. But number two is, of course, the amazing resilience of those people and the continuing dynamism and change and adaptation of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So I pay my respects to the Gameraigal people, to their elders past and present, and I acknowledge their deep and continuing traditions and custodianship over land, water and seas. And as it's Reconciliation Week, this week and every week, we acknowledge that Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land. On a few notes of housekeeping, we're really excited to be joined today by Devon Barnes from Digital Storyteller. So you'll see her up in the corner and she'll be taking a couple of notes and a beautiful digital illustration as we're going along today. So we'll see that getting drawn as we go on. And of course, we are recording this session so we can see it back later. And I'm going to start, first of all, by inviting our CEO, Graham, to say a few words. So Graham, over to you.
Thanks very much, Blaise, and I'm delighted to be here as well. Welcome everyone today. We're celebrating, as Blaise said, the start of National Reconciliation Week, and it's a fireside chat between Nicole Forrester, our relatively new still head of purpose, and Warren Roberts, the founder of Yarn. I'm delighted to have Warren joining us here and looking forward to the story. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I'm on Wurundjeri land in the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. To our colleagues in New Zealand, Tina Kote Katoa. At its heart, National Reconciliation Week is an opportunity for us to focus on individual, organisational and society's commitment to reconciliation. I've actually been saying recently we have an obligation to reconciliation by strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous peoples for the benefit of all Australians. Reconciliation is about truth-telling, understanding, and certainly about learning, particularly for us who are not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It requires the Australian community to recognise and respect the First Peoples of this land, to acknowledge the past injustices, the ongoing inequalities that are experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, all of which have been visited upon them since colonisation, and for all of us to commit to working towards more equal and respectful future. I firmly believe, and I do believe, that Fujitsu stands by a reconciled Australia as one of the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and they're not just accepted but also respected and championed by us who are not part of the community. Where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children will have the same life chances and choices of non-Indigenous children, and the length and quality of a person's life will not be determined by their racial background. It beggars belief that in the 21st century, we still have to shine a light on things like that, but we have to. National Reconciliation Week also provides a time for Australians to learn about our shared histories, cultures, and achievements. Reconciliation is a journey for all Australians. It's individuals, it's families, communities, organisations like Fujitsu, and critically, a nation as a whole. Australia's diversity today is certainly one of its strengths, and we are taking action towards a reconciled future that's fully inclusive and supportive of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' needs, beliefs, and dreams. So today we've got a great opportunity to learn from Warren and explore together how each of us contribute to achieving reconciliation in Australia. I really am looking forward to what Warren has to say to us, and I'm really looking forward to learning myself. This session is being recorded. I think Blaise touched on that, and Q&As will be shared after the session. They'll be posted to Newsfeed on InfoWorld, and recording will be available on Fujitsu Rewind. So without further ado, over to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Graham, and good morning to Team Oceania. This morning, I am paying my respects to the elders past and present of the Turrbal people in Meanjin, which was the local word for Brisbane. And today we are kicking off Reconciliation Week with a special guest, Warren Roberts, the founder of Yarn Australia. Warren is a proud Dunghutti and Bundjalung man who has extensive experience working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. He's worked for NGOs, universities, as well as the state, local and federal governments. Warren has been fortunate enough to work alongside many esteemed elders across the country who have really encouraged him to reflect on the importance of respecting cultural protocols. Warren has received many accolades for his work as a social change maker, including the Young Social Pioneer program at the Foundations for Young Australians, learning with other young social change makers to really amplify the impact of their nonprofits. So thank you so much, Warren, for taking the time to join us here today during National Reconciliation Week. We're glad to have you here.
Great, thank you. I look forward to yarning with you all.
Thank you. So, especially in comparison to old ladies like me, you have been doing this for a while, almost 15 years. I think Yarn was founded in 2007, and it was building on a program that you started at the Armidale School when you founded it at the University of New South Wales. And I was looking into the history with your deadly clever name of Yarn is actually more than just yarn. Would you please tell us about what led you to establishing Yarn and what it means?
Yes, I will just first start by acknowledging the country that I'm on at the moment. I'm on the Gadigal Wongal country. And for the image that's behind me, that's my grandmother's country, and that mountain is called Burrabulai. It's a sacred mountain of our Dunghutti culture. But to answer your question, yes, Yarn has a bigger meaning, and it is about young people, Youth Awareness Resource Network. It's about young people creating awareness of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history and culture, using unique cultures like Zoom, like all these other different platforms that we have around the place, you know, art, music, other forms of mediums to get people to talk. Food is a good one to, you know, build relationships. And, you know, once we all get together, we become a big network of people.
It's really important for us to be able to create a safe space for people to have open discussions to improve understanding and learning. Can you tell us about how you approach this?
We've had many conversations in the many years that we've started doing Yarn, and you know, at university you start to identify these spaces, safe space. This is a safe space, and I always wondered what do they mean by that. And when you get into a room, it's about building a relationship with the folks that's in that space, and having an understanding. And so what we do in Yarn Australia is we always ask, what does some foundational values or some ideals that is of meaning to you? And the way that we've developed that is instead of trying to think of some of the ideas, we thought we'll give you some words here on the screen to help you guide your conversation. So what we encourage people to do is pick a word that is of meaning to you. and share a 1-minute story about what that word means to you.
I love that. So as we're giving people a minute to think about which word really resonates with them and what short story they want to share in the chat as we're working live, perhaps we can just learn a little bit more from you. You mentioned just before that Yarn has had many partnerships with creatives, artists, musicians, dancers. What do you think is important about art within the storytelling and why it's so important to open and safe dialogue?
The way I look at it is about you identifying your gift, talents and passions. And the reason why we start there is because it's within your own power. It's within your own spirit and consciousness is where I want you to start from. If we start talking about things like the Constitution or the Parliament, we're going to get into complexities, and that's out of your power, that's out of your control. So when I think about people wanting to share their story, I want you to start at a place that you know your own content. In other words, you know your own story. But let's not just share our life stories. Let's share intentional stories. We as First Nations people, we are storytellers. We've been telling stories for generations. The best way to connect with us is share stories. And to share stories, like any type of practice of telling stories, it takes practice. We've been practicing for thousands of years, and that's in our nature. We know the stories of the mountains and the trees and the rivers and even that blade of grass. Mm-hmm. So we have been practicing for a while. To deepen your relationship with Australia's First Peoples, learn about your story, become an intentional storyteller.
Oh, that's really powerful. When I think about my own story as a Wiradjuri woman who's lived most of her adult life overseas, the things that connect me back to home are the things that I think about as my story. And that's all about community. And in Yarn, you're really creating new communities across really diverse partnerships. I noticed that you worked not only with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, but universities and corporates, and even I saw you did some work with Engineers Without Borders. What do you think is the secret to the diverse partnerships that you have in creating reconciliation?
It's about creating a space. And we come back to that point, we talk about safe space. This is about an understanding and an agreement on how we would like to work together. So when you establish a safe space, you start to identify the values and the ideals that people have. You know, we don't have a lot of time to learn everybody's yarn, but if I can learn some really simple, intentional things of what is of meaning or what is of value to them, that is a starting point to establish dialogue and create an understanding. So we've worked with a whole bunch of different people. So our more or less our goal is wherever people are, we're about building relationships. So we stand in the space between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to help build and strengthen those relationships.
That's a really important space, building the relationships across what in some previous times and in some cases today continues to be a divide. How do you help nurture those discussions and create those relationships? What are the practical things that we can do in our daily lives that we can learn from you, from your much experience in this space?
The biggest thing that I got taught growing up by my elders is to slow down. I know this is not something that, the West like to hear when it comes to progress. When it comes to KPIs and projects and dates, what I encourage people to do is to slow down. And the saying that was taught to me by my grandmother is, the slower we go, the quicker we get there. But the faster we go, the slower it takes. So it's really important to practice slowing down. And when having conversations, let's really start to be intentional about how we're going to have dialogue. So when I put the words on the screen, I'm only talking about that one word. I'm not we're not here to interpret what you're saying, if it's right or if it's wrong, because when we share stories about our mountain and our culture, it is our truth, right? So when you share your story about your word, of your culture, of your anything that is of value to you, all I can do is respect what your truth is, as much as you would respect mine.
So really, we want all of the team that's joining us today on this call to really think about those intentional words that we put up on the screen before, and perhaps if we can get them back again, and have them select one of those words and share in the chat something that we can hear from them about that's a personal journey. While we're waiting for people to get brave to be able to do that, because it is tough for people, especially in the online world, I was wondering if you could share with us, I think I just saw one, share with us about how COVID and 2020 really changed the way that you worked, and whether or not that allowed the conversations for others to slow down.
Yes, we thought long and hard about technology and the role of technology within yarn, and we were very adamant about, creating space, face-to-face yarns where people get together. And that's just how we've been doing it for, thousands of years. But when like any culture, they adapt and they look at tools and ways of doing things differently. And I noticed a number of our friends and folks out there doing these online, stories, Zooms and conversations and connecting with different folks. And so what I did, I just more or less rang up all my friends who were doing that and said, how do you do that? And how can I, get confident in that process? So in May 2020, we set out to inspire 1 million Australians to become intentional storytellers. And hosting all of our storytellers workshops on Zoom. And because we hosted online, what it allowed us to do is have a national conversation, and it actually provided an access point for many of our supporters and folks out there to be a part of the Yarn Australia conversation in our regional and remote communities, and in spaces where we've never ever engaged a conversation specifically with our wider Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. So it is a national conversation, and we're talking with Australians from all over the country, and it's great to have those times where we can share those stories. The difference is we may well call Australia multicultural and coming of together, black and white, and all these particular sayings we hear around the place. They are all statements. They don't tell you how to build relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We can say all those things till we're blue in the face. What we need to do is actually do it. It's great that we have our unique cultures and our unique stories. But what we're trying to do is create a space where we can hear each other's stories, build relationships, create an understanding. I may well love Greek and Indian and Thai food, but don't ask me about their culture because I wouldn't know. So let's create the spaces where we can really build an intentional relationship and understand the significance and the diversity of Australians.
I think you've touched on a great and a positive note here for people, that we really want to listen to each other's stories. And Graham actually just put in the chat that the word that resonates with him is listen. Warren, how do you think we can, in our daily lives, listen to each other better?
Well, to become a really deadly storyteller, they're the biggest listeners. When I was growing up with my Aboriginal elders, we just did the most listening, because we watched what our elders did and what our elders said and what not to do, what to do and where to go and where not to go. And that's a practice of listening. That's about respect. That's about being patient. That's not about, what are we trying to do? But just being present in the moment. It takes all those skills. And, once you practice it enough, it becomes natural.
Mm.
But what you start to do, you start to really build rapport, and you start to see some connections. You start to see a whole bunch of things than what you would if you were having all, if you continue to do the to and fro and having a lot to say. But what I've noticed in people that have practiced good listening and practiced sharing intentional stories is they come away feeling that they never overshared, or they thought, oh, did I share too much that time, And this is what it comes back to, and it makes the young people that I work with feel, I'm comfortable. I had a really deadly yarn tonight. I was intentional. I shared my 3 stories, and outside those 3 stories, I was just listening to everybody tell their yarns.
So listening to our elders is something that comes from our cultural background. And sometimes I think in non-Indigenous Australian society, perhaps we're not listening to elders as much as what we could have. I see in the chat that Earl has mentioned elders passing down information along song lines. Warren, maybe part of our audience might not be familiar with the term song lines. How would you help them understand that concept?
The way I understand it is it's a relationship between all First Nations peoples. See this mountain behind me? There is a recognition of an importance not only of the Dunghutti, but there's also a recognition of importance from the Gumbaynggirr people. So there are songs and stories that each nation would share with each other around the significant sites and the significant stories of country. So this is about having an understanding. And it's easy to come to a point of understanding if there isn't a relationship, because trust and a whole bunch of other things have able to take place because of the long time it took to build that understanding. So the sharing of our stories and our song and our dance is the practice of that song line that stretches right across this beautiful nation of Australia. And when you become a confident storyteller and you practice your good listening and you share your intentional stories, along the way you might build a relationship with First Nations people, and they may share some of those stories with you.
So there's so many themes here I want to pull out, but I'm going to focus on 2 there. So you talked about time and about trust, and work that I did many moons ago in community. I learnt from listening to elders that you can only move at the pace of trust, and that progress, which you were talking before about, it's you're right in that trust is actually what moves the progress forward rather than time on a clock. And I was just thinking about the time that we concept in today in 2021 is quite different to the concept of time that we've held in our cultures over the last 60,000 years in this country. Often people refer to language like dream time. How would you help people understand that dream time was not necessarily from before, but it's ongoing and continuing, this idea of we are still dreaming?
Within Aboriginal culture, we don't watch the time like the West. What we do is we watch nature. So as you can see on the screen, there's a kookaburra that's on there. That's my personal totem, but in generally across Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, more or less birds are what you call our messengers. They tell stories of country. They tell stories of what's happening, what's not going to happen. They tell stories even about our relationships with each other. So really, we don't have to watch the time. We just watch nature, because what nature is what you call natural law. So we just watch what nature tells us. And growing up with our elders, they always tell us about these stories. They'll say, oh, listen now. And there'll be one bird singing out, or there'll be one bird flying this way, or a whole bunch of things that would take place. And it was because we just watch nature. One thing about people say, oh, well, you've got to go out on country, you've got to get out of the city. Country's not far. You just open the window. You can hear them birds from a long way. You know, connecting to country is pretty easy. If you take the time to practice good listening, you will hear country, and country will, you know, guide you on your walk. And this is what has led for our First Nations people in this country. So birds is very important to our way of being, and then also to our storytelling.
I love that you just said that country's just out the window. That's so true. For me, in my experience living on Quandamuka country, that it's important for me to be able to see the ocean every morning. And I think about the choices that we make in our lives today and how we can contribute more to fairness and justice in this society. As a storyteller, what do you think is the most impactful way to help people understand that there still is injustice in this country if they're personally not touched by it in their daily lives?
Yeah, I always go back to the individual, because it's within your power, it's within your strength and your spirit. Build relationships with Aboriginal people. You might hear some of their stories, or you might attend events where you hear some historical moments in our history. You know, like the Stolen Generation, you might hear about the Paul Keating speech, you might hear about the 65 Freedom Ride. There's a whole bunch of different stories that you can learn some of those historical injustices, but also these historical moments where First Nations people have come together to improve some of those relationships around how we would like to work together within this Australia. And how I look at it, and why I go back to this, you as an individual, it's within your gifts, talent and passion. So what I ask people to do is, no matter what your gift, talent or passion is, find ways that you can include a First Nations voice, a First Nations perspective in the things that you can control. That is what's going to make a better civil society for all peoples, is if we take that personal approach and commitment, and don't make it big. You know, I was talking to a young fellow and he was saying, oh, I'm going to do a talk in Reconciliation Week. What should I say about treaty and constitution and all these other things? I said, well, those are big conversations, and that's more or less out of our control. It requires a whole nation to have a conversation like that. But what I can do as an individual is become a better storyteller, learn more about my story, which takes a practice of reflection. You know, talk about the simple things. You know, it could be about where you like to go swimming, or it could be about you like the sun in the morning. Really think about the simple, real intentional stories that you could reflect on thinking, well, why do we like going to the beach every summer? Where did that practice come from? These are the intentional stories that I'd like you to explore. It does take time, it does take patience, but remember, don't get caught up in the head and the technical thing of it. The way I look at storytelling is not what you see on TV. It's not a script. It's not a movie. This is your story, which is acknowledging your truth. There's no right and wrong answer when it comes to sharing your story. You live it every day. You don't have to go to the past. It doesn't have to be in relation to even the people that your grandparents. It could be to what you have today. It reminded me of a whole bunch of different conversations that I have with people. I remember talking to a police officer and I said, well, I'll put it simply, does the police have a culture when you join the police force? Right? So you can identify these cultures everywhere, but are we creating the spaces to have this type of dialogue? Because if you take if you take project dates and outcomes out of the conversation, it is possible to build a relationship. And once we build a relationship, we do build the trust and the understanding. So it's possible to make agreements. But prior to that, it's very hard to have a conversation about what the future may look like if we don't have a relationship.
Oh, Oh, there's some wisdom being dropped here in serious amounts today. I just realized when you were just talking then that in a way I haven't allowed or facilitated the team who are listening today to hear more of your story by asking you questions directly. So can we ask them to put a question for you in the chat and see if we've got some time left as they get to hear your story from a question that they've asked.
Right.
So people, if you've got a question that you want to ask Warren, please drop it into the chat. So this about being intentional and finding your truth, and that we can think about the future, but we need to be in the present. I do want to know what you think we can do in our storytelling specifically that can actually help people vision. So one of the things that people often say to me, well, what does reconciliation mean? And I say a future where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are celebrated as the First Nations people of this country, and that we can strive and achieve and be heralded for all of the achievements that we have, just like everyone else in the country as well. So that's my vision of what a reconciled Australia looks like. I'd love to hear how you think storytelling plays a role in the reconciliation moving forward.
I think it's the way that our old people have always done it, you know, taking it slow, remembering that, you know, when we look at the present, the idea of time, people say past, present and future. First Nations people don't have more or less that view because it's one linear time. We're all in the time, we're in the past, we're in the present, and we're also in the future. And we're connected to all those particulars. And when you acknowledge that, you know, you have a greater purpose and a greater understanding of things, from that view, from that worldview, is about understanding that, well, we need to create spaces where both worldviews are heard, where both worldviews are possible to have understanding. If you look at any particular agreement making that's happening in this country, no matter if it's in the workplace, in the parliament, or out in the street, until we understand each other's worldview, how can meaningful, intentional agreement making be possible if there's no understanding of our worldviews?
And then that would come back to listening and to trust. We've got a question from one of our team. It's Marty, and he says, "Can you share your connection to country and its importance to your peace and happiness?"
Well, this mountain behind me, I find, you know, when I look at Burrabalai, I feel that I'm at home. And so everything I do in my work, no matter whatever platform I have, I put that mountain behind me. And it always reminds me of my responsibility as a Dunghutti Bundjalung man, that, you know, when I'm working on Gadigal and Wangal country, I have far greater responsibility here because I'm a visitor, because I need to listen more, and because I need to practice patience and all those things to learn about the cultural protocols of this place. So I always carry my cultural protocols that I learn on my country, but I carry it with me with great strength and patience and understanding. So that's one thing that I can share with you of my culture. I carry the spirit of our mountain and our sacred sites with us.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We have a reflection here from one of our team, Earl, who's a proud Luritja man. He says, "My hope for reconciliation. I believe the next phase of reconciliation is by lifting the veil of silence and drive serious effort to dismantle the cult of forgetfulness by not restricting what is taught in schools and throughout the general population. Recognize and reveal all the truths of the history of white Australia." So when I think about history, I think we've got a shared history. How do we tell that story together when perhaps some people don't see that idea of histories being interwoven, not separate?
The way that I explain this is taking the understanding or the opportunity to reflect on your own story. Everything with all the things that you were talking about comes back to this principle of story. And the reason why I say that, because if it's not personal, then do I really care? How do I create the relationship between what is important to me and what's not important to me? And the only way that I can create a bridge or create an understanding or create a connection to that worldview is learning more about your own story. While you're reflecting on your own story, you will find stories of injustice, you will find stories of sadness and joy and happiness and what's possible. That's a bridge towards understanding what is my story. So I have a saying, if you when you learn about your story, you begin to understand my story.
And that makes complete sense, that we have to know ourselves to know others. I was just thinking, in the diverse conversations that you've had in the last 15 years, have you seen that things have shifted for people in knowing their own story? Has your work and the work of others in this truth-telling and storytelling space, has that actually created a new environment for people knowing their own story and therefore being able to know others? Have things shifted in the last 15 years or so, and how?
I think there is great optimism of Australians wanting to have this conversation, but I also acknowledge the complexity of what our history of, of our relationships is tough. Talking about those historical injustices is a tough conversation. But if we can go back to that story, we feel, an understanding and a connection to those things, we were able to have those other conversations about those tough things. One thing I find with the history, it's very hard to go, hey, mob, you need to know all the history of Black Australia. And it's sort of like, hold up, that's a big story. How are we going to do that? That's why I say when it comes to, learning more about Aboriginal and Torres Strait culture and people and history, do it in moments. Let's talk about this moment. One thing I talk to people, they go, I feel, you might feel guilty or you might feel like fingers are pointing. Don't think about those things. Remember in your heart and your spirit and your good intention that you went into that conversation with good intention to learn, to understand, and then leave it within that moment. I've taken the time to talk about the stolen generation within this particular moment. And, all our people want is we don't want a hand up, we don't want donations, we don't want any of those things. What we want is just to be heard. So if you create spaces where our First Nations voices are heard, then it's possible for us to feel included in the space. Because, the things that our people have gone through are tough and horrific things. Things that most Australians don't know nothing about. But if we can create those moments where we can go, hey, I'm intentional, I don't know all the answers, but I'm willing to sit in a space for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 1 hour to have an intentional conversation about specifically stolen generation or any particular topic, and then leave it there. I've taken the time to respect that space, respect the stories, even though I'm coming from a position of maybe not understanding, but at least I've taken the time and the respect to respect the stories of the people and the experiences of First Nations people. And we just got to slow it down. That's it.
I keep coming back to time, trust, respect, and listening and learning. And I'm seeing in the chat, people are starting to recommend great storytellers that they have enjoyed and that they're recommending to the team, which is fantastic. And that makes me think about when you get to meet other great storytellers, who inspires you as a storyteller, and what's the thing that, how have you learnt from them?
Well, my biggest inspiration has been obviously my grandmothers and grandfathers. they're all deadly storytellers, but within their walk, they practice empathy, they practice listening, they practice all those particular things. It reminds me of a moment that I had when I went to boarding school, and you know, all my elders put me there to get a better education. But I was in a space being one of the only Aboriginal boys in that school, and facing racism, ignorance, facing all those things. And I'm thinking in my own spirit, thinking, what are you talking about? You know, why are you saying that? You don't even know me. And then going back to my grandmother and talking to my two grandmothers. And one grandmother said, hey, you got to be proud of who you are, your beautiful brown skin, and be proud of who you are. And the other grandmother said to me, she said, listen, I'll tell you something. No matter what anyone says to you, only you know your own story. And this is what gave me strength to go back into that school, to continue my walk on getting an education and realize, hey, Mob, you don't even know me. You don't even know what you're talking about. And it is coming back to that point, and it all comes back from my grandmother. My grandmother, more or less, was the matriarch of our family. She was the storyteller. She was the person who was the community organizer everybody went to when it came to their particular issues or things that they wanted to support with. She played a role of, you know, the space in between. She walked, you know, talked with the local police. She talked with the local QCs and the local courts, and she spoke with a whole bunch of different services, health services. She worked at the hospital. She worked in the university. And she played that role of the in-between with great ease. And when you're a young fellow like me and you're looking at a strong black woman and you're thinking, this one, she's deadly. And she worked everywhere. She worked for the Australian Electoral Commission. She worked for the Centrelink. She worked everywhere. And I'd come home with these Centrelink forms and go, Nan, what do you think about this? And she'd like, all right, this is how you do it. And in my mind, I'm thinking, gee, this old girl, she's deadly. I don't know, but not knowing later, I knew that, you know, at the end of the day, she worked for Centrelink. But it takes a great person to practice that role of being intentional storyteller and building those relationships. So I get the great strength from my grandmother.
Well, Warren, I thank you for your grandmothers and for all of the ancestors that have walked this land before us. I'm so proud to be working with Fujitsu and to have the opportunity to have platforms like today and the rest of the work that we do throughout the year for reconciling Australia and providing opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to thrive as we want to in our own ways. And so I can't thank you enough for making the time to share with us your stories. And it has been an honour to be with you here today as we kick off National Reconciliation Week for 2021.
Great. I'm honoured to be a part of the conversation, and I look forward to continuing the conversation and hearing your stories.
Thanks very much, Warren. Well, I think Graham's waving. He's on mute. Isn't that great?
Again, that's twice in one call. Thank you very much, Warren. And also, just before we wrap up, I'd just like to say to everyone in Victoria, please stay safe and reach out if you have any troubles with the lockdown that we're about to enter this afternoon. Back to you, Nicole. Thank you. And thanks again, Warren.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. And yes, please, everyone stay safe and remember to respect your stories and each other. Take care. Have a great National Reconciliation Week, and we'll be telling more stories with you soon. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.